Hello, lovely listener. Tonight, we're wandering not through the muddy streets of the village, but into the stone halls of medieval castles. The ones with towers, moats, and, if you're lucky, latrines that don't leak onto your courtyard. We're not chasing dragons or rescuing maidens. No, we're doing something far more thrilling. Unpacking what castle life actually looked like. Spoiler alert. It's less Game of Thrones, more Game of Throne, singular, and made of wood, with a hole. So grab your pillow, maybe light a candle. Don't worry, this one's not made of rancid tallow, and let's go back in time. And hey, if you enjoy these sleepy journeys through strange history, feel free to like, subscribe, or toss a virtual coin to your historian. Imagine you're in a massive stone fortress. Moats outside, banners fluttering, fires crackling. Sounds cozy? Well, you're wrong. Castles were freezers with drafty windows, only with fewer throw blankets and more rats. The stone walls, glorious as they looked, had the insulation power of a wet sock. In winter, you could see your breath in the great hall, next to the fire. And heating, one fire, a few tapestries, and everyone huddled like medieval penguins. Even the nobility wore layers of wool and fur indoors, which sounds luxurious until you realize they weren't regularly washed. You didn't cuddle for romance, you cuddled for survival. Forget swords, crowns, or glittering goblets. The real power in a medieval castle came down to a seat. Not the one in the throne room. No, we're talking about the other throne, the stone cubbyhole, the medieval toilet, the glorious, mysterious, occasionally terrifying garderobe. And yes, this story is going to go down the chute, literally. Let's start with expectations. If you imagine a regal chamber with velvet curtains, incense, and maybe a gold-trimmed porcelain toilet, you're about to be very disappointed. Medieval castle toilets were more like cliffside confessionals. You'd open a narrow wooden door, shuffle into a tiny freezing niche carved into the outer castle wall, and sit over a hole that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a cesspit, sometimes just into the abyss. Some garderobes were communal, others were private, but only in the loosest sense. Doors? Optional. Ventilation? Only if you counted the icy wind whistling through the cracks. Toilet paper? Ah, yes. The 14th century innovation of whatever's nearby and less painful than thorns. Most commonly used: moss, hay, scraps of cloth, or your dignity. If you were rich, you might have a stone seat. If you were very rich, it had a lid. If you were unlucky, the seat cracked in winter and you got to experience a moment of profound clarity about your life choices, while perched above a 6-story drop and trying not to flinch. Now, the term garderobe itself is oddly misleading. It means to guard your robes, and originally referred to a wardrobe. But in the weird logic of medieval linguistics, that's actually connected to the toilet, because people hung their clothes in garderobes to keep them safe from lice. Yes, the smell and ammonia-heavy air repelled insects, which tells you two things. One, medieval people were nothing if not practical. And two, if your closet smells like a sewer, you may be a century too committed to historical accuracy. But this was more than just a toilet. The garderobe was a piece of castle engineering. For example, some castles had multi-level chute systems, where waste fell down into a pit, and then, ideally, got washed out by rainwater or servants who'd done something truly unforgivable. Others emptied into the moat, a charming feature that turned your defensive water system into a sort of raw sewage fondue. Of course, if you're thinking, well, at least the moat kept the smell outside, allow me to crush that optimism. A lot of castles were upwind from their moats, meaning that summer afternoons in the Bailey were a sensory experience not unlike licking a medieval boot. Still, some castles tried to improve the system. Dover Castle, for instance, had a sort of proto-flushing system using rainwater. It sounds advanced, but it still involved dumping buckets of water down the chute. and praying the splash didn't come back. In larger castles, a team of servants called gong farmers had the unenviable task of cleaning the pits. This was, without exaggeration, one of the worst jobs in the medieval world. And they knew it. Gong farmers made good money, partly because they were doing holy work, and partly because no one wanted to sit next to them at dinner. Now for the truly medieval twist. These toilets weren't just about waste disposal. In times of war, they became a tactical liability. Yes, the royal loo could be a siege point. Because garderobes were usually built into the outer wall, they created convenient little cracks in the fortress. Weak points. And attackers noticed. There are documented cases of soldiers sneaking into castles through these openings, which tells us two things. One, medieval plumbing was an architectural risk, and two, some soldiers were way more committed to their job than they should have been. Imagine the scene. You're a knight, polished armor, sword gleaming, ready for glory, and your commander says, "You're going to infiltrate the enemy castle through that hole, the one dripping into the moat, with last week's leftovers. Welcome to the less glamorous side of chivalry." Garderobes also featured in castle etiquette. If you were a guest of the Lord, you were sometimes shown the garderobe as a point of pride. Yes, we recently installed a two-seater, and this one here is angled for maximum airflow, quite modern. It was the 13th century version of showing off your espresso machine. Nobles even put garderobes next to their bedrooms, a privilege unheard of among peasants, who did their business in a bucket and then chucked it into the street with a cheerful cry of "Garde-à-l'eau," which yes evolved from garde-à-l'eau, French for "watch out for the water," because what's more thrilling than dodging falling waste before breakfast? And like everything in the Middle Ages, garderobes came with superstition. It was considered bad luck to use one during a lightning storm. Why? Because the shaft created a direct line between your, let's say, undercarriage and the heavens. You laugh now, but people were actually struck by lightning while on the toilet. What a way to meet God, pants down and panicking. And if you were worried about ghosts, congratulations, so were medieval people. The garderobe was considered one of the likeliest places to encounter a spirit, not because the ghost died there, but because even in the afterlife, apparently, someone has to wait for the bathroom. In conclusion, the castle garderobe was less a throne of comfort and more a seat of mortal peril. It was cold, dark, occasionally haunted, always drafty, and absolutely essential. And yet, despite the engineering, the effort, the sheer intestinal courage it took to use one in January, it was still better than the alternative, squatting outside with the peasants. So next time you're on your own porcelain throne, take a moment to appreciate it. It flushes. It doesn't overlook a moat. And no one's ever tried to break into your house through it. Probably. There's something about the word castle that conjures up grand images. Banners fluttering, trumpets sounding, noble lords sipping wine in embroidered robes. But if you'd actually woken up in a medieval castle, the first thing you'd notice wasn't music, majesty, or even daylight. It was the sound of chickens and screaming. Let's set the scene. It's 5:30 in the morning. Your bed, generously speaking, is a wooden frame stuffed with wool, straw, or feathers, depending on how many sheep you've personally annoyed into cooperation. The mattress smells like at least 3 different types of animals, and the vague memory of cabbage. The sheets, assuming you're a noble, haven't been washed since Lent. Of last year, above you, a timber beam groans ominously. Outside your thin wooden door, footsteps thud across stone. And next to your bed, the fire that kept you from freezing to death last night has long gone out. You can see your breath. And then come the chickens. Yes, chickens. Because despite the castle's soaring towers and carefully carved gargoyles, the place is full of barnyard animals. They roam the halls. They perch on windowsills. They nest under benches. Some of them may be smarter than your cousin. Their clucks are accompanied by the snorts of pigs, the brays of donkeys, the yowls of cats, and the early-rising human known as the scullery maid, banging pots in the kitchen like she's launching a one-woman percussion war. It's not a peaceful wake-up. It's an acoustic ambush. You rise, slowly, stiffly, regretting the decision. The floor is freezing. You step onto the cold stone and immediately wish you hadn't. The chamber pot, half full and entirely unpleasant, taunts you from under the bed. You'll deal with it later. Or, more accurately, a servant will. If you're lucky. Dressing is easy because you slept in your clothes. Everyone does. Pajamas haven't been invented yet, and there's something about the phrase sleep shirt that doesn't sit well with a culture where shirts are often your only garment. If you're a nobleman, your shirt is linen. If you're a noblewoman, your hair is already braided and wrapped in a cloth cap to keep it from tangling or, worse, hosting lice. You might throw on an extra tunic or two, depending on how much frost you can see inside the room. There's no central heating, remember, and the stone walls are less insulation and more decoration. Now comes the question: breakfast. And the answer: pottage. Again. Pottage is the medieval version of that leftover soup you keep adding to every night. Like a culinary Frankenstein. It's a thick, warm sludge of grains, onions, herbs, maybe a few beans or root vegetables if the cook is feeling fancy. The pot itself has not been fully cleaned in weeks, which, horrifyingly, was intentional. The crust on the bottom adds flavor, so they say. The bread? If you get any, it's yesterday's, or the day before's. Hard enough to serve as both food and weapon. The crust could chip a tooth. The inside is dense, gray, and smells like damp socks. No toast, no jam, no pancakes. And no cutlery either. You eat with your fingers or dip a piece of bread directly into the bowl. Plates are optional. Sharing is not. What about drinks? Surely there's coffee. Absolutely not. You drink beer. Yes, even at breakfast. Especially at breakfast. Not the fun, frothy, hoppy kind. This is small beer. Low alcohol, brewed quickly, and safer than water. Because water, as we now know, is a liquid betrayal. If you're important enough, you might also get watered-down wine. If you're lucky, it's not been tampered with. But in a medieval castle, food poisoning isn't a rare accident. It's just Tuesday. Children drink beer too. It's not considered improper. It's considered smart parenting. Honestly, it's a miracle they ever sobered up enough to invent the Renaissance. And now we meet the staff. You might think life in a castle meant a peaceful morning, lounging while your maids bring trays of food and your hounds snooze quietly by the hearth. You'd be wrong. The staff is up long before you, already fighting fires. Metaphorical and literal. Fires were risky business. Starting one wasn't easy, and once lit, it had to be watched like an over-caffeinated hawk. Embers could mean dinner or disaster. The kitchens, by the way, were often in a separate building or a remote wing of the castle. Not because they liked the walk, but because they were always on fire. Kitchen smoke, grease, boiling pots, and no fire code? That's how you end up with charred stews and charred staff. The only fire extinguisher was a wet rag and a desperate prayer to St. Lawrence, patron of cooks and things that are tragically overdone. Then there's the noise. Castle's echo. Stone carries sound like a medieval megaphone. Every clang, stomp, and yell bounces around the walls like it's trying to win a jousting match with your eardrums. The dogs bark, the horses in the stable snort and stomp, and your cousin, yes, him again, is already arguing with someone about who stole his last boiled egg. He's always been dramatic. Probably the diet. There's a guard change on the battlements, a priest muttering morning prayers, and someone dropping a bucket of milk, which now smells like regret and cheese. Probably both. And while you eat your pottage, squinting through your third layer of wool, trying to block out the cold and the smell of damp animal, you wonder, how did people ever consider this a luxury? Because compared to the peasants outside the walls, who are waking up under thatched roofs with chickens in their beds and actual mud as their carpet, this is paradise. You have a seat, you have food, you have beer, and the roof is mostly not on fire. What more could a 14th century noble ask for? You might think fashion in a medieval castle was all grace and glamour, flowing gowns, velvet cloaks, and carefully curled hair under delicate golden circlets. Let me stop you right there. Getting dressed in a medieval castle was less runway ready and more onion cosplay layers. So many layers. And not for fashion's sake either, for survival. The drafty stone halls of your luxury fortress could drop to meat locker levels before breakfast. The term chill in the air was not poetic. It was literal, and often accompanied by actual icicles forming on your pillow. Let's start with the undergarments. And no, this isn't about lingerie. We're talking linen. Long, plain linen shifts or shirts, worn by both men and women as a base layer. They were itchy, poorly shaped, and often the cleanest thing a person wore, mostly because they were easier to wash than your 4-pound wool overdress. Women wore a chemise. Men wore a shirt that reached mid-thigh. These undergarments acted as a physical barrier between you and your heavier outer clothing, which, if you were lucky, hadn't been colonized by lice yet. Over this came more linen, then wool, then more wool, and then a cloak, and maybe another cloak, because nothing says noble status like being shaped like a fabric-draped turnip. For the ladies, layering got creative. After the chemise came the kirtle, a long fitted gown that acted as the base dress. Over that, a surcoat, possibly fur-lined. Sleeves could be tight or billowy, depending on whether you were more concerned with impressing the local friar or keeping your hands from turning blue. Hair had its own rules. A noblewoman might braid it, wrap it in cloth, or cover it with a wimple, that gauzy face-framing garment that makes everyone look mildly surprised and vaguely saintly. Later centuries introduced the hennin. You know, those cone-shaped hats that look like they were stolen from a wizard's formal wear drawer. Why the hat? Modesty, mostly. And because head lice are harder to spot if your head looks like a tent. For the men, the situation wasn't much better. Tunic, surcoat, hose, belt, cloak, fur-lined boots if you were lucky. If you weren't, just hope your toes didn't fall off mid-feast. Men's fashion in castles swung wildly between practical long tunic and tight leggings that scream midlife crisis. One century, everyone was wearing baggy robes. The next, nobles squeezed into hose so tight they made modern skinny jeans look like parachute pants. And no medieval man worth his salt would go without a codpiece, the oddly shaped, disturbingly prominent flap of fabric covering. Well, you know, it was both fashion statement and armor, a velvet-clad declaration of status, or insecurity, often both. Colors mattered too, a lot. Your dye choices said everything about your wealth, your rank, and occasionally your laundry mishaps. Bright blues and deep reds meant money. Purples meant serious money. Browns and grays meant you were either a peasant or going for that blending in with the rats aesthetic. And green? Surprisingly popular. Peasants wore it because green dye was cheap. Nobles wore it because it looked nice next to gold. Robin Hood wore it because, well, branding. Let's pause here to discuss fabrics. There was no polyester, no elastic, no moisture-wicking anything. Everything was either linen, wool, or, if you were rich, silk. But not the shiny modern kind. More like, this was once smooth, but has now absorbed 3 centuries of dust and gossip. Wool was scratchy, heavy, and absurdly warm. In summer, it turned you into a sweaty swamp creature. In winter, it was the only thing keeping you from becoming a noble-shaped ice sculpture. Silk was rare and imported, often costing more than a small pig farm. If you had silk, you wore silk, even if it was wildly impractical. Especially if it was wildly impractical. Now, let's talk laundry, or rather, the general lack of it. Outer clothing was washed infrequently, if at all. You'd wear your gown or tunic for weeks, maybe months. If it started walking away on its own, that was your sign. Until then, you relied on scent masking, sprigs of herbs sewn into collars, perfumed oils, or just sheer denial. Laundering a full set of noble clothing was a multi-day operation involving rivers, ash soap, boiling water, and the patience of 3 strong women and a helpful saint. Which is why, in many portraits, nobles look slightly stiff. They weren't posing. They were just trying not to rip their only good outfit. Accessories were also status symbols. Gloves, belts, brooches, buttons. Medieval people loved buttons. Not because they were useful. Laces did most of the work, but because buttons showed off wealth. You'd have dozens sewn down your sleeve just to prove you could afford someone to sew them there. Jewelry was another layer of the fashion onion. Rings, pins, and chains were worn by men and women alike. The more you jingled when you walked, the more impressive you were considered, like a fashionable wind chime with gout. And yes, people wore purses attached to belts. There were no pockets. If you wanted to carry a comb, a coin, or a saint's finger bone, don't ask. You needed a pouch. And if someone stole it, well, that's your fault for having unattached accessories in a castle full of bored teenagers. Getting dressed took time. Even with servants, it wasn't a quick process. You needed help lacing corsets, buttoning sleeves, adjusting layers, and placing your headdress just so. A misplaced veil could cause an entire corridor of monks to faint. And once you were dressed, you stayed that way. All day. All night, even. Changing outfits wasn't just inconvenient. It was considered vain. Unless you were going to a feast, or a duel, or your cousin's beheading, you wore your standard uniform of mild discomfort and maximal fabric. In the end, medieval castle fashion wasn't about comfort. It was about identity. Who you were. What you owned. What you didn't catch from the neighbor's goat. So the next time you throw on sweatpants and call it a day, remember, your ancestors layered themselves like soggy pastries, walked stiffly through drafty halls, and used sprigs of rosemary as deodorant. And still thought they looked amazing. You're standing at the threshold of the Great Hall. It's long, drafty, echoey, and dimly lit, unless it's a feast day. Then it's dimly lit with enthusiasm. Tapestries hang on the walls to make the cold stones slightly less prison-like. The ceiling so high you could lose a minstrel in it. And the floor, covered in rushes and crumbs, a kind of medieval carpet/snack tray for the resident mice. This is not just a room. This is the social engine of the castle, the place where nobles dine, gossip, negotiate marriages, argue about soup, and listen to lute solos that go on slightly too long. Let's talk seating arrangements first, because where you sit matters. A lot. The lord and lady sit at the high table, elevated above the rest, like mildly bored monarchs watching a particularly chaotic school play. To their right, the most important guests. To their left, the second most important. Farther down the hall, lesser nobles. Near the doors, servants. Near the hearth, a juggler, probably. Or someone's cousin who won a favor in a dice game. If you're at the high table, congratulations. You're rich, powerful, and about to be very well fed. If you're not, you're still getting fed. Just, with fewer spices and more bones. The food? Oh, it's abundant, but not always edible. Contrary to what movies suggest, medieval food wasn't just piles of greasy meat. It was a carefully staged affair. Yes, there was meat, roasted, stewed, sometimes still twitching, but also fish, pies, porridge, stewed fruits, candied vegetables, and bread. So much bread. The wealthy dined on manchet bread, soft and white, made from refined wheat flour. Everyone else gnawed on coarse maslin loaves, a chewy mix of rye and barley that doubled as a jaw workout. Plates? Optional. Most food was served on trenchers, slabs of stale bread used as edible plates. After the meal, the trenchers could be eaten, given to the poor, or tossed to the dogs, depending on how generous you felt or how hungry the dogs looked. Forks? Non-existent. People ate with knives and fingers. The knife was for cutting, the fingers were for everything else. You tore, dipped, scooped, and occasionally gestured with your food. Licking your fingers was expected, but licking someone else's fingers was shockingly frowned upon. Cleanliness, in theory, was a virtue. Before meals, guests were offered a bowl of water and a towel. Not to wash your hands, mind you, just your fingers, and only the tips, and only the right hand. The left hand was, well, for other things. We won't discuss that before a meal. Also, personal napkins weren't really a thing yet. If you needed to wipe your hands or mouth, you used the tablecloth, or your sleeve, or someone else's sleeve if you were low on shame and high on wine. Now let's get into the feasting itself. A medieval feast had courses, not appetizer, entree, dessert. More like, here are 12 different meats, 3 pies with birds inside, a fish molded into the shape of a castle, and a pudding that may or may not scream when you cut it. Dishes came in waves, accompanied by music, toasts, and performers. Acrobats, jugglers, dancers, or that one guy who could burp in Latin. Entertainment was a must. So were subtleties, elaborate food sculptures designed to amaze. Think, a roast peacock with its feathers reattached. A pie that opens to reveal live doves. A gelatin castle filled with sweetened almond paste and regret. Were these foods delicious? Sometimes. Were they practical? Absolutely not, but practicality is for peasants. Feasts were about spectacle. And speaking of spectacle, let's discuss the rules. Medieval dining etiquette was strict and utterly baffling. For example, don't point your knife at anyone unless you're actively dueling them. Don't wipe your nose on the tablecloth, unless it's an emergency. Don't lean over and sniff the food too closely. It's considered greedy. Also risky, given the prevalence of bees in mead. Burping? Surprisingly okay. It showed appreciation. Farting? Depends on who heard it. If it was the Lord, you blame the dog. If it was the dog, you blame the minstrel. And talking with your mouth full? Only allowed if you're making a dramatic toast or retelling the tale of that one time your cousin got locked in the privy. Let's not forget the drinks. Wine if you're fancy. Ale if you're normal. Mead if you're feeling poetic. Water if you've made peace with death. Medieval wine was often mixed with herbs or spices to cover up the fact that it had been sitting in a sun-warmed barrel since the last crusade. Ale, meanwhile, came in small, low alcohol, and strong. High risk of waking up in someone else's armor. And of course toasts were constant. To the host, to the church, to the king, to Saint Ethelbert, patron of indigestion. By the time dessert arrived, everyone was either crying, dancing, or asleep in a chair. Speaking of dessert, it wasn't cake. Well, not the way we know it. Medieval sweets were heavy on nuts, honey, spices, and confusion. Puddings, jellied fruits, fritters, marzipan, and spiced wine were common. Sugar was rare and expensive, so it was used sparingly, unless you were trying to impress someone. Then you sugared everything, including possibly the family crest, and if you really wanted to show off, you served gold leaf on your desserts. Not for flavor, just to remind people that you had money and weren't afraid to poop shiny things. Eventually, the feast would wind down. The servants would clear the mess. The dogs would fight over trenchers. A jester would fall asleep in the hearth. And guests would either shuffle off to their cold beds or curl up under the table with someone whose name they forgot 2 goblets ago. The great hall would grow quiet, except for the sounds of snoring, settling rushes, and the occasional rat dragging a piece of candied eel toward the cellar. And so the feast ends, not with a bang, but with a snore, a spilled cup, and someone softly mumbling a love song to their leftover pudding. There's a reason every castle tour comes with a ghost story, and it's not just because the guide wants tips. It's because medieval castles were, without exaggeration, some of the creepiest places on earth. Long corridors, echoing footsteps, cold drafts, distant screams, real or imagined, and staircases that went nowhere. All illuminated by flickering torches that turned every shadow into a minor panic attack. If you weren't superstitious before, a single night in one of these stone behemoths would have you clutching your rosary and sleeping with a dagger under your pillow. And maybe a priest. Let's begin with the architecture. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. That meant thick stone walls, narrow staircases, spiral towers, and oddly placed rooms. These weren't designed by interior decorators. They were designed by people who believed the only good intruder was one who got lost, fell down a well, or was impaled on a decorative spike. Which means even without ghosts, a medieval castle at night was terrifying. The walls creaked, the wind howled through arrow slits, tapestries swayed mysteriously, and somewhere, always, there was a cat. Add to that the fact that most castles had secret passages, real ones, built for escape or eavesdropping, and you've got a perfect recipe for ghostly misunderstandings. That low whisper in the hallway could be a spirit, could be your cousin spying on you through a wall crack, the faint sobbing in the next room. Either a ghostly maiden or someone discovering the bathwater has cooled again. Then there were the ghosts themselves. Medieval people believed in the afterlife with an intensity that bordered on anxiety. Heaven was a goal. Hell was terrifying. And purgatory? That was everyone's side quest. The idea that souls could linger, unfinished, angry, confused, was not only accepted, it was expected. You didn't just hear ghost stories, you prepared for them. Noble families hired priests to pray for deceased relatives so they wouldn't come back. Not because it was sweet, but because if you forgot, Uncle Jeffrey might appear at the foot of your bed, moaning about his unwashed sins. And it didn't help that castles were full of death, dungeons, executions, plague outbreaks, that one guy who choked on a pigeon bone during Lent. If something could go horribly wrong, it had already happened, right where you were trying to sleep. Castle chapels were built not just for worship, but to contain the holy vibes, like spiritual air fresheners. Monks were brought in to cleanse rooms. Holy water was splashed liberally. Sometimes people slept with relics under their pillow, just in case the Virgin Mary needed to pull an all-nighter on ghost patrol. The most haunted places? The tower room where the lady jumped, every castle has one. The spiral staircase where someone fell, usually while carrying soup. The abandoned nursery, because nothing says, sweet dreams, like ghost children. The oubliette, a literal hole in the floor where prisoners were dropped and forgotten. Oubliette comes from the French oublier, to forget. Romantic language, horrifying application. Some castles even had cursed rooms, kept locked for generations. Stories were passed down. Don't enter the western chamber after sundown. Never open that iron door, even if it knocks back. If the cat refuses to enter, neither should you. And so on. Cats, by the way, were considered natural ghost detectors. Also demons. It was confusing. Let's talk symptoms of haunting. If you lived in a castle and experienced any of the following, it meant ghosts were near. Sudden cold gusts, which, in a stone building with no insulation, was constant. Disembodied footsteps, also constant. Mysterious stains. Don't ask. Tapestries that moved on their own, common. A sudden smell of roses or sulfur, either ghosts or the privy was leaking again. In fact, many perfectly normal medieval castle experiences were blamed on the supernatural. Tripped over a loose stone? Ghost. Candle went out? Ghost. Misplaced your codpiece? Definitely a mischievous spirit. And yet, people stayed. Why? Because castles were also seen as places of power, spiritual strongholds. Many had chapels where masses were held regularly, not just to worship, but to keep the undead out. Think of it as divine pest control. Sometimes, though, the haunting became official. The local priest would bless the room. If that didn't work, they might assign a monk to sleep there. A punishment so feared that a sign to the West Tower became a code for, "You really messed up." And if that didn't work, you just avoided that wing, put up a tapestry, called it the quiet corridor, told guests it was closed for renovations, forever. And what did the ghosts want? Usually the same three things. Revenge. You married someone they hated. Restitution. You forgot to light a candle for them. Company. Because haunting is lonely work, and they hadn't had a decent conversation since the plague. Some ghosts were helpful, warning of betrayal, predicting attacks, pointing to hidden treasure. Others just paced and cried and made bedtime difficult. And some were more theatrical. There are stories of headless knights riding ghostly horses through banquet halls, monks levitating over spiral stairs, and spectral pigs, yes, pigs, wandering the cellars. Because why not? Ultimately, medieval castles were haunted because medieval minds were haunted by war, disease, religion, and guilt. The walls were thick, the nights were long, and every noise was amplified by candlelight and anxiety. If you ever visit a castle and feel a chill, it might just be the wind, or bad plumbing, or perhaps someone who never left. Either way, you should probably light a candle, just in case. Let's get something out of the way. The medieval castle bedroom, despite its noble air and rich tapestries, was not a cozy retreat. It was a box of stone, a bed full of bugs, and an acoustic nightmare where sleep was more of a group project than a personal activity. If you've ever shared a hotel room with 6 relatives, one who snores like a lawnmower, another who talks in their sleep, and one mysterious shadow in the corner, congratulations, you've already survived a night in a medieval castle. First, the room, the bedchamber sounds private, doesn't it? A place of velvet drapes, candlelit reading, and gentle snoring. In reality, privacy didn't exist. Most nobles shared their bedrooms not only with their spouses, but with servants, children, sometimes guests, and occasionally the local priest who refused to leave. And even if the lord and lady had their own room, there was always someone in there, stoking the fire, delivering clothes, refilling chamber pots, or just lingering. Walls were thin, floors were creaky, and everything echoed. You couldn't sneeze without the cook 3 floors down saying, "Bless you." And if you did anything more romantic, well, you can bet the entire household was reviewing it over breakfast. Now, the beds were status symbols. The bigger, the better. Not necessarily for comfort, but because they were expensive, rare, and something you could mention in your will. To my beloved nephew, The feather bed, slightly haunted, but still soft. A noble bed was high off the ground. So high, in fact, you often needed steps to climb in. Why? Partly for warmth. Being off the cold stone floor was critical, and partly for style. Also, nothing says power like needing a ladder to get under your blanket. The mattress was stuffed with feathers, straw, or wool, depending on wealth and the number of geese you had personally upset. Over that, sheets, maybe linen, maybe burlap, thick woolen blankets and animal pelts, and over all of it, a canopy to keep out drafts, falling dust, and, according to some, spiders with judgmental stares. The bed frame creaked, the mattress sagged, the lice partied, and yet, compared to the floor, luxury. Who was in the bed? Short answer, everyone. Servants might sleep in the same room or on the same bed, especially if the Lord needed someone to help him into his hose at 3 a.m. Children shared the family bed until they were old enough to roll over without kicking a parent in the kidney. Inns operated similarly. You booked a spot in a bed, not the bed itself. You might fall asleep beside your cousin and wake up next to a stranger with questionable breath and a truly heroic snore. Even the nobility expected company. Sleeping alone was not only lonely, it was considered unsafe. The night was full of dangers: cold, spirits, bad dreams, and occasionally your own thoughts. Having a warm body next to you, even if it was your uncle's squire, meant protection. Or at least someone to blame for the smell. Nightcaps, nightshirts, and nightmares. The medieval person didn't just hop into bed in their socks and sweats. Sleepwear was minimal, but specific. A nightshirt, long, linen, shapeless, was common. Think Ebenezer Scrooge minus the redemption arc. For warmth, you'd wear your nightcap, a pointed, floppy hat that made you look like a wizard in retirement. These weren't optional. Heat escapes from the head, and castles were cold. If your scalp froze, you were doing sleep wrong. Nightcaps also served as a social cue. If someone answered the door wearing one, it meant, "I'm in no state to talk to you, please go away, or prepare to discuss theology at midnight." And dreams? Dreams were serious business. The medieval mind saw dreams as spiritual messages. Good ones came from God, bad ones came from demons. Indigestion came from peasants, and it was often hard to tell the difference. Woke up sweating after dreaming of fire? That might be a warning of sin. Dreamed of drowning? You'd better confess something. Dreamed of your teeth falling out? Definitely demons. Or too much boiled turnip. Dreams were discussed, written down, interpreted. Some nobles even kept dream journals or told their chaplains what they saw in their sleep, just in case they needed urgent spiritual debugging. Midnight routines, fun fact. Medieval people didn't sleep all the way through the night. They practiced segmented sleep, 2 sleep phases, separated by a watch period in the middle of the night. This wasn't insomnia. It was scheduled. People would wake naturally after 4 hours, sit up, tend the fire, pray, talk quietly, or, and this is well documented, engage in intimacy, because nothing says romance like a 2 a.m. fire check and the sound of mice in the rafters. After an hour or two of this midnight intermission, people went back to bed for their second sleep, waking at dawn when the birds, bells, or intrusive sunlight told them their medieval dreams were over. The challenges of sleep. You think you've had a rough night's sleep? Try nodding off with a roaring fire that throws sparks onto your straw mattress. Rats running laps across the beams. A chamber pot that sloshes when the wind blows. A tapestry depicting martyrdom staring directly at you. A bedfellow with the flu, gout, or ghost problems. And the castle's night sounds were no help. Everything echoed, the wind howled. Hinges squeaked. If a cat knocked over a bucket in the kitchen, the noise could reach the battlements. You didn't just go to sleep, you negotiated with it. And yet, somehow, people managed. They dreamed, they snored, they whispered prayers to saints of sleep. They woke with stiff necks, cold feet, and mysterious bruises, often from elbows, sometimes from guilt, occasionally from ghosts. But the castle bedchamber, for all its discomfort, was sacred. It was where the day ended, where your power robes came off, where the fancy hat was tossed aside, where you were just a person, cold, tired, and hoping the pig stayed in the hallway this time. So next time you curl up in your quiet room, on your soft mattress, beneath your warm blanket, alone and undisturbed, say a little thank you to your ancestors. They walked, crawled, and snored, so you could nap in peace. Now when you think of a medieval castle, fun probably isn't the first word that comes to mind. Damp? Sure. Defensive stronghold? Absolutely. But between plagues, wars, and the unceasing struggle to keep one's boots dry, it's easy to forget. People in castles knew how to enjoy themselves, sometimes with music, sometimes with games, and occasionally with something that involved mild violence and a really confused goose. Let's begin indoors, because, let's be honest, it's cold out. A quiet evening in the Great Hall might include music from a lute, the medieval version of a guitar that looks like it once dreamed of being a pair. Lute music was gentle, plucky, and often accompanied by singing, sometimes ballads, sometimes courtly love songs, sometimes drinking tunes that made little sense but got louder as the night went on. The nobility were expected to be cultured, which meant knowing how to play an instrument badly, recite poetry dramatically, or, at the very least, pretend to be listening while someone else did those things. There were also board games. No, not Monopoly. They wanted land for real. But games like Nine Men's Morris, a strategy game played with tokens on a board that looked like a confused tic-tac-toe grid. Backgammon, which was actually ancient by then. And dice games, which were less about skill and more about shouting, gambling, and trying not to get excommunicated for betting away your cousin's mule. Cards? Not yet. That was more of a late medieval thing. But riddles and story contests were popular. Imagine sitting in a smoky hall, warm ale in hand, and challenging someone to name 5 saints who could fit in a barrel. Loser buys the next round. Now let's step outside, because the courtyard is where things get weird. Tournaments were the medieval version of a sports event, theater, and reality TV show combined. Knights in full armor charged at each other with lances, trying to knock one another off horses, while a crowd of nobles shouted encouragement, placed bets, and occasionally got splattered with bits of jousting debris. But jousting wasn't the only event. There were melee battles, where teams of knights beat each other with blunt weapons until someone surrendered or forgot their name. Archery contests, which were slightly safer, and falconry, where nobility showed off their trained birds of prey, hoping they'd catch a rabbit and not someone's unattended lapdog. For the peasants, and let's be honest, for a lot of bored nobles too, the favorite entertainment was animal baiting. This was, unfortunately, exactly what it sounds like. Bears, bulls, or chained animals were set against dogs for sport. People cheered, jeered, and treated it like Sunday brunch. There were even trained monkeys dressed in night outfits. Why? Because nothing says cultural refinement like a small primate on a pony. And then there was goose pulling. Yes, that was a real thing. A goose was hung upside down from a rope, and riders would gallop past and try to yank its head off. Today, we call this, quote, animal cruelty. In the 14th century, they called it Tuesday. Not everything was violent, though. There were feast day celebrations, especially during festivals like Epiphany, Easter, and All Hallows' Eve. These could include Morris dancing, where men in bells leapt and twirled while waving sticks, for joy, not combat. Mumming, a bizarre form of masked performance that was half play, half parade, and fully confusing. And the Lord of Misrule, a festival tradition where a chosen fool or servant ruled over the castle for a day, issuing silly orders like, "Everyone must speak in rhyme," or "Dinner must be eaten backwards." Imagine your most uptight noble being told to eat dessert first and recite love poems to a roasted pig. That's medieval joy. For the intellectuals, yes, they existed. There were philosophical debates, often involving monks, scholars, or anyone with a strong opinion and access to wine. These debates covered topics such as, can angels dance on the head of a pin? What's the proper color of sin? And, if you die in a dream, do you wake up in purgatory? Most ended with someone falling asleep or being challenged to a duel. And of course, let's not forget jesters. Contrary to myth, jesters weren't just fools and belles. A good jester was witty, sharp-tongued, and often the only person allowed to mock the Lord without being immediately beheaded. They performed songs, jokes, impressions, and if needed, acrobatics. Many were well-educated, multilingual, and more politically aware than half the court. If you were laughing at a jester, you were probably being insulted in a clever way and too slow to notice. But perhaps the most cherished entertainment of all? Storytelling. After dinner, by the fire, people would gather nobles, servants, visitors, and swap tales. Myths, legends, ghost stories, family embarrassments, tales of far-off lands, or ridiculous things the king did once. He definitely did. They always do. It was through these stories that people escaped from the cold, the monotony, and the daily risk of being trampled by a goat on the stairs. Stories passed the time, lit the imagination, and turned even the bleakest castle into a place of wonder. So yes, fun existed behind those stone walls. It was loud, weird, sometimes dangerous, often smelly, but always human. People played, danced, competed, mocked, celebrated, and occasionally wrestled pigs for prizes. Because life was short, winter was long, and sometimes what you needed most wasn't a warhorse, but a good laugh and someone playing the bagpipes badly in the corner. Imagine you're enjoying your barley soup in the great hall when someone 3 seats down sneezes. Loudly, twice, the room freezes. Eyes widen, utensils stop mid-air, and the Lord, normally unflappable even during bear baiting, slowly pushes his bowl away. Because in a medieval castle, a sneeze wasn't just a bodily function, it was a warning shot. And if there was one thing that scared a noble more than a peasant rebellion or running out of wine, it was illness. Let's be clear. Medieval medicine was equal parts faith, folklore, and guesswork. And when it came to getting sick, the castle didn't offer much more than what you'd find in a decent barn, but with fancier curtains. If you were lucky, your castle had a physician. These men had studied at universities, often in Paris or Bologna, and wore long robes that made them look important. They knew all about humors, not the funny kind, but the bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, that, according to ancient wisdom, controlled everything from your moods to your appetite to why you stubbed your toe yesterday. Too cheerful? Must be excess blood. Melancholy? Clearly too much black bile. Random boils? That's probably God's will, but let's bleed you just to be safe. Ah, yes, bleeding. The universal remedy. Feeling ill, bleed. Headache, bleed. Gout, bleed. Nosebleed, double bleed. They used leeches, knives, or if they were feeling experimental, hot cups. Bloodletting was believed to balance the humors and remove bad spirits, which is a poetic way of saying, let's drain a pint and see what happens. Patients would lie back on a bed, arm extended, eyes closed, hoping the barber surgeon had had a good breakfast and steady hands. That's right, barber surgeons. Because in many castles, the guy who cut your hair also cut your arm open, a multitasking hero with sharp tools and no anesthesia. If bleeding didn't work, spoiler, it often didn't, there were other options. Herbal remedies were the medieval version of natural wellness. Some worked: willow bark for pain, garlic for infections. Others, not so much. Common ingredients included wormwood to purge the body, hog lard for topical application, ground toad, yes, that's exactly what it sounds like, and occasionally mummy dust, real or fake, believed to have healing powers, because what's better than rubbing ancient dehydrated pharaoh on your boils? Castles also had infirmaries, though calling them that might be generous. It was usually a cold room near the chapel, with a few straw-stuffed beds, some sad curtains, and a monk muttering prayers over you while holding a suspiciously fragrant poultice. If your illness was deemed contagious, plague, for example, you might be quarantined, or more accurately, locked in a tower room with food shoved under the door and a general hope that either God or time would sort you out. Compassionate? No effective? Also no. But perhaps nothing terrified castle dwellers more than plague. The Black Death made a particular impression, not just for its mortality rate, but for the chaos it caused. Whole wings were abandoned, servants fled, windows were boarded up, and anyone coughing in public was likely to find themselves gently but firmly escorted to the moat. People carried posies of herbs to ward off the miasma, bad air believed to cause disease. Nobles burned incense, threw rosewater on the floors, or hired musicians to play loudly enough to drown out the coughing. Some even commissioned plague doctors, those mysterious figures in beaked masks filled with herbs, although to be fair, those didn't become common until a bit later. Still, the concept of "if I look like a bird, disease can't find me" was strangely comforting. Let's not forget surgery, if you were brave or desperate. A castle surgeon could perform tooth extractions, amputations, boil lancing, and even trepanation, drilling a hole in your skull to relieve pressure or release evil spirits. Sometimes it worked, sometimes you died. Either way, people clapped. There was no anesthesia beyond alcohol, a bite stick, or passing out from terror. Surgical tools were rarely cleaned because bacteria hadn't been invented yet, scientifically at least. Wounds were sealed with hot irons, wine, or honey, or a quick prayer if nothing else was handy. And yet, people survived. Many recovered from fevers, wounds, infections, often through sheer luck, a tough constitution, or the fact that their illness was probably just scurvy and a nap helped. The sick were tended to by servants, family members, or monks. Meals were adapted to the condition: broth for weakness, bland mush for stomach ailments, and dry bread for moral improvement. If you made it through, you were expected to give thanks, often publicly, and preferably with a donation to the church, the physician, and the man who kept your chamber pot from overflowing during your darkest hour. But what happened when someone died? Castles were prepared. The body was washed, shrouded, prayed over, and placed in the chapel or great hall for mourning. Nobles had elaborate funerals, servants had simpler ones. Either way, death was treated with both fear and familiarity. It was always nearby. And, in true medieval style, will-making often included specific instructions like, "Please bury me with my favorite sword, half a loaf of bread, and my left slipper, so I may be recognized in the afterlife." Who were we to argue? In the end, getting sick in a castle was less about medicine and more about endurance, physical, emotional, and spiritual. It involved trust, prayer, bandages that smelled like soup, and the occasional heroic leech. So next time you sneeze and someone offers you a tissue, be thankful. It could have been a bowl of ground toad and a guy with a very sharp knife. If you imagine childhood in a medieval castle as a blend of fairy tales and pillow fights, stop right there. Being a child in the castle wasn't about tea parties and teddy bears. It was about manners, mud, and medieval Latin, served with a side of early responsibility and zero bubble baths. Yes, there were moments of joy, but make no mistake, by the age of 7, you were expected to act less like a kid and more like a very short, slightly confused adult. Birth. Not exactly a royal affair. First, let's start at the very beginning. Being born in a castle didn't mean soft lighting and a team of trained professionals. It meant a dim room, a midwife with strong hands and stronger opinions, and a crowd of family and servants loitering nearby in case the heir arrived early or didn't arrive at all. Infant mortality was high. So was maternal mortality. Births were messy, dangerous, and often loud enough to be heard through 3 stone corridors. But if the baby survived, there were celebrations, naming ceremonies, blessings, feasts, and the hasty scribbling of "It's a boy" letters to distant relatives hoping for a slice of inheritance pie. Infancy. Swaddled and suspicious medieval infants were swaddled tightly, arms bound to their sides like tiny burritos. This wasn't just for warmth. It was believed to help the body grow straight. The result? Babies looked less like toddlers and more like bewildered loaves of bread. They were rarely left alone. A nurse or wet nurse handled feeding, soothing, and keeping the child from rolling into the fire. Toys were basic: carved animals, rattles, cloth dolls, or the family dog's tail, until the dog noticed. But fun was not the main focus. Babies were seen as potential adults, their value tied to what they might become, not how adorably they drooled on Aunt Matilda's sleeve. Childhood, ages 4 to 7, learn fast or fall behind. Once you could walk without falling into the moat, expectations kicked in. Boys and girls of noble birth were taught manners, prayers, and household expectations early. They learned how to speak clearly, bow or curtsy properly, and never put both elbows on the table during stew. A noble child's day might include morning prayers, learning table manners, watching adults at court, listening to stories of saints, heroes, or that one uncle who fell off a horse and claimed divine vision. They were taught to respect elders, serve guests politely, and, importantly, never ask for seconds before the Lord did. Even if they were really hungry. Education, noble style. Around age 7, noble boys were often sent away to be pages in another noble household, not as punishment but as education. This was castle-based boarding school, minus recess. Pages learned sword etiquette, don't wave it near the cook. Horse handling, don't fall off. Music, preferably lute or flute, not just enthusiastic whistling. Reading, mostly Latin and prayers. And most importantly, how to serve gracefully. Yes, young nobles served at table, cleaned armor, and delivered messages, not because they were low status, but because learning to serve was part of learning to rule. Girls stayed closer to home, trained in household management, needlework, music, and diplomacy. They learned to run estates, manage servants, and occasionally talk their way out of marriage proposals using only a raised eyebrow and embroidery metaphors. Discipline. Firm but confusing castle discipline was a strange mix of strict rules and wild freedom. One moment, a child might be praised for reciting psalms. The next, punished for spilling ink on a monk's habit. Corporal punishment existed, but so did long lectures, extra prayers, and, if the child was particularly unlucky, silent reflection near the privy. Children of the lower classes faced harsher rules, but noble kids were expected to internalize honor, loyalty, and obedience, unless, of course, they were royal. In which case, tantrums were just political statements in miniature. Playtime. Not as cute as you'd think children played. Of course they did. But medieval play wasn't always gentle. Games included mock sword fights with real bruises, wrestling, hide and seek, tag, marbles, stone ones, and something called stool ball, which may have been an ancestor of cricket or an excuse to hit people with a paddle. Dolls were made from cloth, sticks, or wax. Miniature knights on horseback were carved from wood. Some games taught real skills, balancing, aiming, even courtship techniques. Yes, even childhood flirtation was part of your training. And while laughter echoed through castle halls, so did screams. Broken bones weren't uncommon. Neither were scraped knees, bumped heads, and the occasional, well, he was warned not to joust indoors. Teen years, when childhood ends early. By age 14, most children were considered young adults. Boys became squires, training directly under a knight. This involved caring for weapons, learning battle strategy, and practicing how not to drop your sword while dismounting dramatically. Girls, meanwhile, were sometimes married off. Yes, married. Not always consummated, but alliances were forged young. If not married, they might enter convents, work as ladies-in-waiting, or train in estate management. The idea of teenagers didn't exist. You went from child to adult with little ceremony, usually marked by your first battle, your first dinner without supervision, or your first extremely awkward conversation about heirs. And yet joy existed. Despite the pressure, the rules, and the expectation to grow up fast, medieval children laughed. They played with puppies. They told jokes. They built towers out of firewood. They slipped apples from the kitchen and dared each other to jump the moat. They listened wide-eyed to ghost stories, fought over who got the biggest trencher, and stared out windows wondering if dragons were real. In short, they were children, wrapped in wool, weighed down by expectation, but filled with curiosity, chaos, and the endless questions that even the castle walls couldn't hold back. Modern romance has its rules. Swipe right, flirt awkwardly, get ghosted, try again. Medieval romance? Slightly more complicated. Because in the castle, love was never just about love. It was about land, lineage, dowries, allegiances, and maybe a little poetry. If you wanted to marry for passion, you'd best be very clever, very lucky, or very far from your parents' estate. Marriage, the ultimate power play. Let's begin with the basics. Who you married mattered more than who you liked. Noble families arranged marriages as if they were merging kingdoms, or at least herds of goats. A union between two households could mean more land, more soldiers, a stronger claim to a distant throne, or in some cases, fewer family feuds, at least temporarily. The bride and groom? Sometimes they hadn't met, sometimes they were children, and sometimes they were cousins. A lot of cousins. The medieval nobility made the family tree look more like a family wreath. Courtship, subtle as a catapult. If a young man did hope to win a lady's heart, he had to know the rules of courtly love. This was a bizarre, poetic, often unrequited dance of flowery compliments. Your eyes pierce me like 1,000 saintly swords. Daring gestures, rescuing her veil from the moat, and letters full of longing and probably too many metaphors. The lady, in turn, would respond with icy politeness or playful scorn, as required by tradition. And just to clarify, courtly love was usually not about marriage. It was often between knights and already married noblewomen, and was more about longing than doing. It was like medieval fan fiction, dramatic, impractical, and slightly scandalous if taken seriously. The proposal, aka the negotiation table, when it came time for a real marriage, it was less roses and more contracts. Parents, and sometimes kings, negotiated dowries, land rights, inheritance clauses, and who got to keep the good horse. The bride's family might offer a sum of money, a piece of land, or even a castle, usually the drafty one with bad plumbing. In return, the groom promised support, protection, and possibly not dying in battle within the first 6 months. Once agreed upon, the engagement was official. And if either party tried to back out, let's just say lawyers existed even then, and some of them had swords. The wedding, sacred and slightly chaotic medieval weddings, were religious ceremonies, sometimes elaborate, sometimes shockingly brief. The church required consent from both parties, surprisingly progressive, a public ceremony to avoid secret unions, and the exchange of vows, not always rings. Rings were optional. A good pair of gloves could work just as well. The reception? That's where the fun began. Feasts, music, dancing, and lots of toasts. Some brides wore blue for purity. Some wore whatever was clean. Grooms wore armor if they suspected drama. And someone always got too drunk and tried to duel the dessert. The marriage bed. Hope and high stakes. After the feast came the bedding ceremony. Yes, a public one. In some castles, guests escorted the couple to the bedroom, offered blessings, sang songs, and sometimes stayed to watch. Others just waited outside and listened for confirmation. This wasn't just intrusive, it was political. A consummated marriage sealed the deal. If things didn't go as planned, the alliance could be voided. Or worse, the couple would be subject to rumors, papal interventions, and Aunt Gertrude's disapproving glare. Life as a married couple, not always a love story. Once the excitement wore off, reality set in. Married life in the castle involved running estates together or apart, managing servants, attending feasts, hosting pilgrims, avoiding scandals, and producing heirs, ideally many, to ensure at least one survived past infancy. Love could blossom over time, or not. Some couples grew close, became companions, even partners in governance. Others lived separate lives, united only by name, a shared bedchamber, and mutual suspicion. Affairs, flirtations, and forbidden love. Was there infidelity? Of course. The church preached fidelity, but the nobility, well, practiced flexibility. Knights fell for noblewomen. Ladies pined for troubadours. Priests wrote poetry under pseudonyms. And some people just made very poor decisions at the midsummer feast. The penalties for adultery varied. For women, scandal, shame, exile, or worse. For men, usually a firm talking to and maybe a sarcastic sermon. Double standards? Absolutely. Medieval society had more of those than it had baths. Second marriages and unions of convenience widows and widowers were hot property, especially if they came with land. Remarrying wasn't just accepted, it was expected, and often very fast. Some noblewomen remarried within weeks, not for love, but because someone needed to run the estate and defend the henhouse from invading relatives. Marriages could also be annulled if they weren't consummated, or if the couple turned out to be related. Again, common problem. And then there were clandestine marriages, secret unions without witnesses or approval. These caused no end of trouble. Because once you tied the knot, especially without a priest, proving it wasn't legally binding required a small miracle and 2 honest witnesses, rare in castle politics. And yet, real love happened amid the contracts, alliances, and awkward poetry. True affection did bloom. Some couples wrote letters that glowed with warmth. Some rulers genuinely adored their queens. Some knights composed songs so earnest even the stone walls blushed. Love was difficult, daring, and occasionally disastrous, but it was present. And for those rare few who managed to find both passion and partnership in the drafty corners of castle life, they were the luckiest of all. In medieval castles, faith wasn't just a matter of belief. It was the air people breathed, the structure of their day, and, in some cases, the reason no one ate meat on Wednesdays. Every noble, servant, knight, and cook lived under the ever-present weight of the church. Salvation was the ultimate goal. Sin was everywhere. And if something went wrong, from failed harvests to stubbed toes, someone, somewhere, probably wasn't praying hard enough. The castle chapel, holiness on site. Every decent castle had its own chapel, usually small, cold, and dimly lit, but deeply respected. It was the first place a baby was baptized, the last stop before burial, and the daily destination for prayer, confession, and silent guilt. The Lord and Lady sat in special seats near the front. Everyone else stood, knelt, or leaned awkwardly against the wall while pretending they weren't falling asleep during the third recitation of the Magnificat. The chapel held holy relics, a saint's finger, a scrap of cloth, or in one case, an entire thumb bone labeled Saint Basil probably, a simple altar with flickering candles, and a priest who lived either in the castle or nearby, depending on the budget and how much the last priest had snored. A day in the life of worship, faith was baked into the daily rhythm of castle life. Morning prayers before meals. Mass, often attended by the noble family and the servants, silently judging. Grace before every meal, even the sad porridge ones. Vespers, evening prayers, where you begged forgiveness for sins committed since lunch. And if you were very devout, or very afraid, matins in the early hours, often attended only by monks and extremely guilty squires. Sundays were for public worship, clean tunics, and politely pretending you liked the bishop's sermon. And yes, missing Mass without a good reason could land you in hot ecclesiastical water, which, like everything else in a castle, was probably tepid at best. Saints, heavenly helpers on speed dial. If you needed help with something, anything, there was a saint for that. Lost something? Saint Anthony. Toothache? Saint Apollonia. Going into battle? Saint George. Having trouble with geese? Saint Gertrude. Possibly also cats. Saints were celebrities of the medieval world. People wore medals, carried relics, and whispered urgent prayers like spiritual text messages. Some castles even boasted relics, pieces of saints housed in jeweled boxes. The more exotic, the better. A splinter of the true cross? Top tier. A vial of holy water from Jerusalem? Excellent. A feather allegedly dropped by the Holy Spirit in 1247? Slightly suspicious, but still good for blessings. Confession, guilt, and the art of not exploding confession was a regular event, particularly for the nobility. After all, when you rule over dozens of people and occasionally chop off heads, you accumulate spiritual baggage. People confessed everything: petty theft, lying about who broke the wine jug, lustful thoughts about the lady in the tapestry, forgetting to fast, and occasionally making deals with the devil, usually exaggerated. The priest would listen, nod, and assign a penance, prayers, fasting, or maybe a small donation to the chapel roof repair fund, which somehow always needed money. Confession wasn't just religious, it was political. A noble's public piety could sway alliances, earn support, or, in a pinch, help avoid excommunication, which was basically medieval cancellation with eternal consequences. Fasting, feasting, and food rules that made no sense. The church had rules about food, lots of them. Meat was forbidden on Wednesdays, Fridays, certain saints, days, all of Lent, and whenever the cook felt particularly righteous. Fish was allowed, including things that weren't technically fish but lived in water, like beavers and puffins. Yes, really, puffins were classified as fish by some church authorities. Medieval logic, 1. Zoology, 0. Lent meals in castles could be extravagant, despite the restrictions. Fancy almond milk stews, jellied fish, and fake meats made from crushed peas and deceit. Because if you can't eat roast pig, you can at least eat something pretending to be roast pig. God appreciates the effort. Pilgrimage, the medieval road trip. If you really needed spiritual help, or just a break from castle drama, you might go on pilgrimage. Destinations included Canterbury for English folks, Santiago de Compostela for the ambitious, or, if you had money and strong legs, Jerusalem. Pilgrimages were dangerous, expensive, and exhausting. But they were also status symbols. Returning home with a scallop shell or holy dust made you a minor celebrity. It also gave you weeks of storytelling material. That time I outran a bandit and accidentally converted a goat. And if you couldn't go yourself, you could pay someone to do it for you, which honestly sounds very modern. Fear, hope, and the afterlife medieval faith wasn't all comfort and choir music. There was also terror. Hell was hot, eternal, and filled with very creative punishments. Purgatory was a long, smoky waiting room. Heaven was glorious, but required paperwork. Good deeds, confession, charity, etc. People bought indulgences, payments to reduce time in purgatory. They funded church renovations and sometimes very fancy bishops. Hats. Nobles wrote wills promising donations to monasteries if monks would pray for their souls. Some even left instructions to be buried with candles, coins, or an entire Bible, just in case. And yet, through all the fear and fire and brimstone sermons, faith offered structure, comfort, and community. It gave people hope. It explained the unexplainable. It offered rituals to mark life's biggest moments: birth, marriage, death, and the occasional inexplicable goose disappearance. And in the castle, where life was uncertain and death often close, faith gave everyone, from lord to laundry maid, something to hold on to. Even if it was just a St. Christopher pendant and a slightly too pious bowl of lentils. Every castle has its stories. Not just the ones etched in records, dates, battles, noble births, but the ones passed from servant to squire, from guard to gossip, around hearth fires and under the creak of rafters. These are the castle legends, tales of bravery, betrayal, curses, monsters, and the occasional wizard who really just wanted some peace and quiet. True? Sometimes. Exaggerated? Always. Entertaining? Absolutely. The Dragon. In the Hill. Let's begin with the classic. The Dragon. Many castles have stories of dragons sleeping beneath them, especially those built on hills or surrounded by mysterious caves. One such tale told of a dragon slumbering under a tower, snoring so loudly the walls shook at night. Another said the creature would wake once every 100 years and demand a maiden, or a pie, depending on the version. Dragons represented chaos, greed, or even pagan fears. But they were also excuses. Moat smells weird, dragon breath. Walls cracking, dragon rolling over. Sir Geoffrey didn't show up for work, dragon ate him, or ale did. The wizard in the cellar. Then there's the inevitable castle wizard, sometimes locked in a tower, sometimes wandering the halls in slippers and muttering about the stars. One tale from the north claimed a wizard once turned the castle well into a portal. Another said he made the Lord's enemies disappear, or at least sneeze uncontrollably for months. Often, these wizards were just scholars or alchemists, men with books, odd gadgets, and a suspicious number of herbs. But superstition ran deep, and anyone who could read Latin and keep a secret was halfway to being mistaken for a sorcerer. One popular myth claimed a castle's library could only be entered at midnight, and only if you recited the Lord's Prayer backwards. Do not try this, especially if the librarian is watching. Secret tunnels and hidden doors. Every castle had secret passages, or at least rumors of them. Some were real, built for escape during sieges or to sneak servants around unseen. Others were imaginary, dreamed up by bored guards or hopeful children. Legend often told of a tunnel connecting the castle to a distant monastery, 15 miles away and always full of bats. A hidden stairwell beneath the chapel that led to treasure or skeletons. or a door in the pantry that opened only when the moonlight struck a specific sausage. This one may have been invented by a particularly lazy cook. Explorers later found some of these tunnels. Others turned out to be wine cellars with excellent acoustics and very poor lighting. The ghost in the West Wing, every castle has a haunted room. Always. Sometimes it's a tower. Sometimes it's a corridor. Always the West Wing for some reason. Ghosts varied. The weeping lady, waiting for a lover who never returned. The headless knight, endlessly searching for his helmet or a mirror. The child with a toy, seen only by other children. Or, most chilling, the silent monk, who appeared only during thunderstorms and smelled faintly of ink and judgment. Servants swapped stories, noble guests swore they saw something, and cats, well, cats always stared at nothing, just to keep people on edge. Cursed stones and talking gargoyles. Some castles had individual stones said to be cursed. If you stepped on one, looked at it too long, or tried to clean it, disaster would follow. One famous tale claimed a mason once removed a cracked stone from a chapel wall, only to find his beard fell out overnight and the eggs wouldn't boil for a month. Then there were gargoyles, decorative and functional. They spouted water, but also rumored to come alive at dusk. Children were warned not to talk near them after sunset, lest the gargoyle repeat their secrets to the Lord, or worse, to his mother-in-law. Lost treasures, buried truths. It's not a proper castle legend without a hidden treasure. Some stories claimed gold was buried beneath the Great Hall, accessible only by solving riddles left in stained glass. Others said a knight hid his riches behind a false wall in the guardroom, but died before revealing which one. More than one renovation revealed strange artifacts. A locked chest with no key, a child's shoe behind the hearth, placed to ward off spirits, or inscriptions carved backwards into stone, usually Latin, usually cryptic, occasionally just "do not touch." Not all treasure was gold. Some tales spoke of books that whispered to readers, candlesticks that never went out, or a painting that aged when you weren't looking. That one's suspiciously familiar. The Festival of Fools. One favorite castle legend was the annual Festival of Fools, a real event in many places, but wrapped in myth. During this festival, roles reversed. Servants became lords, jesters became judges, and rules were suspended for one day. But legend claimed if the fool gave a command that was too cruel, the castle would be cursed with silence. No laughter, no song, only whispers. Until the next full moon. Guests were warned not to mock the feast too loudly, or they'd hear bells in the night, and not the jolly kind. Why these myths mattered? These weren't just stories to pass the time. They were anchors, ways to explain the unexplainable. They gave voice to fears, hopes, and history, too messy to write down. They made the castle alive, not just a building, but a place of memory, magic, and mystery. A place where anything could happen. A place where someone once saw something strange and told someone else, who told someone else, until the pantry ghost became family tradition. And whether or not the dragon ever stirred, or the wizard ever finished his book, or the treasure ever glittered in moonlight, the tales endured. Because in the end, every stone keeps a secret, and every castle, if you listen closely, still whispers its stories. When the last torch dims and the fire in the great hall crackles into silence, the castle rests. It does not vanish, it does not crumble, it simply breathes more slowly. All the bustle, the servants clattering over uneven stones, the knights laughing in the courtyard, the sharp scold of a steward over misplaced spoons, fades into memory. What's left are walls that remember, a place made of people. It's easy to think of castles as just stone and banners, towering walls and heavy gates. But truly, castles were communities, strange, layered little cities of their own. Inside those cold halls lived children learning to walk, then ride, then rule. Old cooks muttering about proper stewing temperatures, scribes catching naps between pages, jesters testing out jokes on sleepy dogs, lords staring out windows, unsure whether they ruled anything at all. The castle held laughter and loss, hymns and hiccups, strategy and spilled soup. And through it all, the rhythm of daily life pulsed on. Not just battles and banners, history remembers the sieges, the marriages, the alliances forged over goblets of wine. But it forgets the way the sun hit the chapel window on a quiet Thursday, the boy who got caught putting socks on a chicken, the girl who wrote poems on scraps of old parchment and hid them behind the tapestry. It forgets the servants who knew every squeaky floorboard and every lord's favorite spoon, the gatekeepers who named the pigeons, the washerwomen who sang off-key and didn't care. These were the moments that made the castle alive, not the grandeur, but the ordinary. And what are the stories? They stay, not in books, not always, but in the air, in the architecture, in the way the staircase curves just slightly too wide, as if built to carry secrets up and down. They stay in the myths passed down, the knight who saved a cat from a tower and was knighted twice for it, the lady who hid a goose in her sleeve during a feast and blamed it on divine intervention, the priest who accidentally invented a stew so good it was declared a miracle. Silly? Maybe. But aren't all the best stories? If you ever find yourself near one, should you ever walk the crumbling grounds of an old castle, be it in England, France, Spain, or just a convincing corner of your imagination, stop for a moment. Look past the battlements, past the dusty plaques. Listen for laughter behind the stones. And if you catch the faint echo of music, or a voice whispering a rhyme that makes no sense, smile. You've just brushed against history, lightly. And history, if nothing else, loves to be remembered. So here's to the castles, to their myths, their mice, their madness. To the people who live there, grand, ordinary, confused, romantic, itchy, hopeful. To the ghosts who stay not to haunt, but to make sure no one forgets that once, in that very room, someone spilled soup on a bishop and lived to laugh about it. And to you, the listener, the dreamer, may your nights be peaceful, your pillows dry, and your windows free of dragons. The castle sleeps now, so should you.